May 8, 1945, 2:17 p.m. In the makeshift interrogation room of an American headquarters near Nuremberg, Brigadier General Howard Mitchell sat across from a German prisoner of war. What transpired over the next few hours would be recorded in classified military protocols as one of the most embarrassing moments in American military history. The captured German Oberst began to speak calmly, citing page numbers, paragraphs, tactical formations. General Mitchell froze. The German was reciting verbatim from Field Manual 105, the U.S. Army's foundational manual for operations, but it wasn't the current 1944 edition. No, he was quoting from the forgotten 1923 edition, including tactics that even West Point graduates were no longer taught. In that moment, the general grasped a shattering truth. The enemy hadn't just fought them, he had studied them, he had understood them, and he had beaten them with their own knowledge. The man sitting in a dirt-stained uniform before General Mitchell was Oberst Franz Bäke, one of the German armed forces' most brilliant tactical minds. Born in Munich in 1898, Bäke had developed a dedication that set him apart from his comrades. While other officers studied German military doctrine, Bäke devoured everything he could find about Allied tactics. Even in the 1920s, when Germany was officially disarmed and the Reichswehr numbered only 100,000 men, Bäke began his lifelong mission. He became fluent in English and French. He used intermediaries in Switzerland to order American and British military manuals. He studied French doctrine, American tank theory, British infantry tactics. What began as an academic interest became a passion, then an obsession. His comrades initially mocked him. "Bäke and his books," they'd say, laughing. No one was laughing when the war began. In 1939, when the German armed forces invaded Poland, Bäke was already a major and the deputy commander of a tank regiment, but his real weapon wasn't the tanks under his command. It was the knowledge in his head. In his private library in Munich, he had over 300 books on Allied military tactics, many filled with handwritten notes in the margins. Field Manual 100-5, FM 7-10 on infantry tactics, the British infantry training manuals from 1937, the French Instructions sur l'emploi tactique des grandes unités from 1936. Bäke hadn't just read them, he had memorized them. He knew the weaknesses, the standard responses, the predictable movements. When Germany attacked France in 1940, Bäke used this knowledge on the battlefield for the first time. The results were devastating for the Allies. May 12, 1940, 11:42 a.m. near Sedan. Major Bäke commanded a tank detachment that encountered a French defensive position. Standard procedure dictated that German tanks would attempt a frontal assault with artillery support. Bäke ordered something different. He had studied how French officers were trained, their doctrine for counterattacks, their predictable reactions to flanking threats. He positioned a small group of tanks east of the French line, in plain sight, appearing to be a clumsy flanking threat, just as French doctrine dictated. The French commander pulled his mobile reserve to that location to neutralize the threat. In that moment, Bäke struck. His main force, hidden in the woods west of the position, broke through the now weakened French line in just 23 minutes. The French commander, Oberst Dubois, later wrote in his report, "The German commander knew our doctrine better than we did. He played us like a fiddle." 340 French soldiers were captured. Bäke lost 3 tanks, but that was only the beginning. When Bäke fought on the Eastern Front in 1941, he used his knowledge of Soviet tactics, which were heavily influenced by French and British doctrine. In the winter of 1941, while defending against Soviet counterattacks near Moscow, Bäke read a translated Soviet field manual found on a destroyed tank. He immediately recognized that it was almost verbatim from the Soviet PU-39, the field regulations of 1939, which, in turn, were based on French concepts. Moreover, the Soviets had had American advisors in the 1930s. Bäke could predict their movements because he knew the books they learned from. January 7th, 1942, minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit near Rzhev. Oberstleutnant. Bäke was defending a sector against an expected Soviet attack. His unit, battle-worn to just 60% strength, faced 3,000 attacking Soviet soldiers with tank support. Any other commander would have set up a linear defense. Bäke did something that confused his own men. He pulled his defensive line back 400 meters, leaving the obvious defensive positions empty. His officers protested. Bäke calmly explained, "The Soviets use the same preparatory artillery tactics as the American army since 1918. They shell the obvious positions for 30 minutes, then they attack. We won't be there." He was right. At 06:15 hours, the Soviet artillery fire began right on the abandoned positions. At 06:45 hours, when the Soviet infantry advanced, Bäke's troops opened fire from their hidden positions. The Soviets, expecting to engage weakened defenders, walked right into a barrage. The attack collapsed in 2 hours. 740 Soviet soldiers fell. Bäke lost 19 men. The Soviet commander, General Major Mikhail Petrov, wrote in his report to the Soviet High Command, "The German commander knew our artillery preparation times exactly. It was as if he had read our orders." In a way, he had. Bäke had studied the Soviet artillery tables, which in turn were based on French methods that he had found in French manuals from the 1920s. He wasn't fighting soldiers, he was fighting their training, and he was winning, because he knew that training better than they did themselves. In 1942, Bäke was promoted to Oberst and given command of the 11th Tank Regiment. His reputation grew within the German armed forces. The professor, his men called him, partly respectfully, partly amused. In his command tank, he didn't carry maps. He carried copies of Allied field manuals, American FM 1710 on tank employment, British armored fighting vehicles training from 1940. When anticipating an Allied attack, he would pore over their manuals, searching for standard tactics, for predictable reactions. He then constructed his defenses, not against the tanks themselves, but against the very doctrine the tank commanders had been taught. But then, they stumbled upon something that sent a chill down their spines. November 1942, North Africa. German armed forces troops captured a damaged American Sherman tank near El Alamein. Inside, they discovered a document, the current edition of FM 17-32, the tank company, light and medium. It was less than 2 months old, printed in September 1942 in Washington, D.C. Somehow, a copy reached Bäke in just 3 weeks. What he read brought a smile to his face. The Americans were coming, and he already knew how they would fight. January 1943, Tunisia. American troops engaged the German armed forces on a large scale for the first time. Bäke, now stationed in North Africa, was waiting for them. He had studied FM 17-32, page by page. He knew the American tank company tactics. 3 tank platoons of 5 tanks each. Wedge formation for the attack. Standard distances of 50 to 100 meters between vehicles. Prescribed communication procedures. The Americans were predictable because their manuals left no room for improvisation. German officers improvised constantly. American officers followed the manual. February 14th, 1943, 10:35 a.m., Kasserine Pass. Colonel Bäke positioned his tanks in the hills above the pass. He saw the approaching American Sherman tanks through his binoculars. They were forming up exactly as FM 1732 dictated. Wedge formation, 3 platoons. Standard distances, Baker muttered to his adjutant. They're following page 47, figure 12, exactly like the manual. That means their command tanks are the second ones in each platoon. He gave the order. First volley, only on the second tanks in each platoon. 6 German tanks fired simultaneously. 3 American Sherman tanks exploded. The command tanks of all 3 platoons were destroyed in one stroke. The remaining American tanks, without leadership, attempted to react according to FM 17-32. Upon loss of leadership, withdraw and regroup. But Bäke already knew that. His tanks had already pre-sighted the withdrawal routes. Within 18 minutes, 17 American Sherman tanks were destroyed or burning. Bäke didn't lose a single tank. The surviving American commander, Captain James Moore, was captured. During interrogation, a German officer asked him, "Why did you use the wedge formation? Why not the line formation?" Moore replied, confused. "The manual says wedge formation for attacking through open terrain." The German officer smiled sadly. "Yes, it does. Page 47. Moore turned pale. Years later, in his memoirs, Moore wrote, "In that moment, I realized we weren't fighting soldiers. We were fighting someone who knew our own military school better than our instructors." That was the moment American intelligence wrote a desperate report. March 1943. A secret memorandum from G2, the Military Intelligence Division, reached the Pentagon. There is mounting evidence that German commanders in North Africa have access to current American field manuals. Enemy tactics demonstrate detailed knowledge of our standard procedures. Recommendation, modification of critical doctrine elements, and restriction of distribution of FM documents in the field. The report landed on General Dwight D. Eisenhower's desk. His handwritten note in the margin, "How the hell do they know our own manuals better than we do?" But for Bäke, it was too late to change. He had a photographic memory and decades of experience. Even if the Americans printed new manuals, they were based on the same fundamental principles he had been studying since the 1920s. American military doctrine came from Leavenworth, from West Point. From decades of ingrained theories, Bäke knew those theories. He knew the men who wrote them. He had read their books, their articles, their published reflections. He wasn't fighting American soldiers. He was fighting Leavenworth. And Leavenworth didn't even know it was at war. July 1943, Sicily. The Allies landed on the island. Bäke, returning from North Africa, was sent to defend with a combat-depleted tank detachment. He had only 18 operational tanks against hundreds of American and British vehicles. But he had something else, copies of FM 3135, Aviation in Support of Ground Forces, and FM 120, Command and Employment of Air Power. He knew exactly how the Allies would use their air superiority because their own manuals described it. The manuals said, air attacks concentrate on main roads, identified tank concentrations, and obvious command posts. So Bäke avoided main roads, hid his tanks individually under trees instead of in groups, and commanded from an ordinary truck instead of from a recognizable command vehicle. Allied air reconnaissance reported no significant tank forces in Sector 7. Bäke and his 18 tanks were in Sector 7. They were simply invisible because they didn't look like what FM 3040. Handbook on German Military Forces described as how German tanks should operate. July 17th, 1943, 3:23 p.m., near Gela. An American tank company, 14 Sherman tanks, advanced. According to their maps and their aerial reconnaissance, the area was clear. Bäke let them get closer, 800 meters, 600 meters, 400 meters. Then, on his signal, His 18 tanks opened fire from hidden positions. The battle lasted only 11 minutes. 12 Sherman tanks were burning. The surviving 2 fled. Bäke lost 3 tanks, but not to enemy fire, to mechanical problems. The American Air Force officer responsible for reconnaissance faced a court-martial. How had he missed 18 tanks? He hadn't missed them. They were there. He had only looked for what FM 30-40 said he should be looking for. Bäke had read the manual. He knew what they were looking for, so he showed them something else. 1944. Eastern Front. Defending against the Soviet summer offensive. Operation Bagration. Bäke now commanded a mixed battle group. Reinforced with infantry and artillery, the Soviets, massively equipped with American Lend-Lease vehicles and weapons, attacked. But they were also using American doctrine, learned from American advisors. Bäke read the captured Soviet orders and immediately recognized American influences. The Soviets planned a wide frontal assault with concentrated reserves for breakthrough exploitation. That was, word for word, from FM 105. Bäke didn't build his defenses against the frontal assault itself. He built them against the reserves. June 23, 1944, 04:15 hours, near Vitebsk. The Soviet artillery fire began, massive and devastating. Bäke's prepared positions were shattered, but they were empty. His main forces were 600 meters back, concealed in the forests. At 05:30 hours, the Soviet infantry rolled forward, followed by T-34 tanks. They overwhelmed the forward positions. Exactly as FM 105 taught, then came the Soviet reserves, 3 fresh tank regiments ready for the breakthrough. Bäke waited until they reached the breakthrough zone, an open area where FM 105 said that reserves should maximize speed for exploitation. In the moment the Soviet tanks increased their speed, their formation loosening for a rapid advance. Bäke's hidden tanks and camouflaged anti-tank guns opened fire. 47 Soviet tanks burned in 30 minutes. The Soviet attack collapsed, not through German superiority, but through American doctrine that the Soviets had learned and that Bäke had studied. The secret report that would later reveal the true depths of their fear was written in October 1944. An American intelligence officer, Colonel David Richardson, was sent to Europe to investigate why German defenses were so effectively predicting American attacks. Richardson interviewed surviving German prisoners, studied captured German documents. What he found shocked him. In a captured German headquarters, his team found a library, over 200 American, British and French military manuals, some decades old, others almost brand new, notes in the margins, in German, pages marked, tactics compared, weaknesses identified. Richardson's report, classified as top secret until 1973, wrote, "We have underestimated the enemy. We thought they were reacting to our tactics. They are not. They have studied them. They know them. They know them better than most of our officers. We have lost an intellectual war that we didn't even know existed." May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. Colonel Franz Bäke, exhausted, wounded, hungry, surrendered to American troops near Nuremberg. He was taken to a provisional POW camp. The Americans didn't know who they had captured. To them, he was just another German colonel. But then, the next day, the interrogation began. Brigadier General Howard Mitchell, in charge of interrogating high-ranking German officers, sat down across from Bäke. Mitchell, a West Point graduate, class of 1928, a combat-hardened officer, began with standard questions, unit, command levels, operations. Bäke answered politely, cooperatively. Then Mitchell made a mistake. He tried to impress Bäke with tactical knowledge, asking him about the German reaction to American tank tactics. Bäke smiled slightly. "You mean The tactics from Field Manual 17 to 32. May I ask which edition you're referring to? The September 1942 one, or the revised March 1944 version? Mitchell froze. You know our field manuals? Mitchell asked cautiously. Bake nodded. Yes, of course. FM 17 to 32, FM 100 to 5, FM 710, FM 3135. I could go on. Which one would you like to discuss? The color drained from Mitchell's face. That's impossible. Those documents are restricted. Bake smiled sadly. General Mitchell, if I'm not mistaken, you graduated from West Point in 1928. You probably had Colonel Morrison for tactics. He primarily taught from the 1923 edition of Field Manual 105, with an emphasis on open warfare and mobile operations. Am I correct? Mitchell couldn't speak. Bäke continued. FM 105 from 1923, page 134, paragraph 3. The object of all operations is the destruction of the enemy's armed forces. Page 156. Paragraph 7. Speed is essential to exploitation. These principles haven't changed in your current doctrine. Why would they? They're solid principles, based on Jomini and Clausewitz. Mitchell called his superior. Within an hour, Bäke was sitting before 3 American generals. What happened over the next 4 hours was recorded in a secret transcript that wasn't declassified until 1976. The generals tested Bäke. They asked technical questions about American doctrine. Bäke answered every single one. He corrected a general about the proper application of FM 7-40 infantry regiment. He recited from FM 100 to 15, Field Service Regulations, 1941 edition, sections that the generals themselves didn't know by heart. One of the generals, Major General Robert Thompson, a highly decorated officer, asked a trick question about outdated artillery tactics. Bäke smiled. You're referring to the doctrine from the 1917 edition, General. That was revised in 1923. The fire distribution tables were completely changed to reflect modern fire and movement. General Thompson became furious. How the hell do you know that? Bäke answered calmly. Because I studied it, General. Since 1925, I've read every edition, every revision, every article in your infantry journal, your cavalry journal, your field artillery journal. I've read books by your leading thinkers. Patton's War as I Knew It was particularly insightful. Eisenhower's article on tank warfare from 1920 was brilliant. I knew your army better than most of your officers, because I didn't just practice it, I studied it. The silence in the room was oppressive. One of the generals, Brigadier General William Harrison, asked quietly, Why? Why did you do this? Bäke looked at him, tired, but with clear eyes. Because the next war was coming. We all knew that after Versailles, and when it came, I wanted to be prepared, and not with more tanks or airplanes, with knowledge. Sun Tzu said, Know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles, you will never be in peril. I knew you. I knew your strengths, your weaknesses, your predictability. Your greatest weakness wasn't your courage or your equipment. It was your rigidity. Your manuals left no room for improvisation. German officers improvise. American officers follow the manual. That made you predictable. General Mitchell, regaining his composure, asked, Then tell me, Colonel Bäke, what should we have done differently? Bäke thought for a moment. Teach your officers to think, not to obey. Your manuals are good, just brilliant even, but if everyone follows them the same way, the enemy will predict them. At the War Academy in Berlin, we learned Auftragstaktik, mission command. The officer is given the objective, but not how to achieve it. He improvises. Your officers receive detailed orders. They execute them. That is the difference. The generals looked at each other. One of them muttered, "Jesus Christ, he's right." General Thompson asked, "How many German officers are like you?" Bäke shook his head. "Not many. Most only studied German doctrine. I was an exception, a dedication." Mitchell asked, "Would you have won against us if you'd had more resources?" Bäke smiled sadly. "General, that's the wrong question. We lost the war, not because we didn't understand you. We lost because we were fighting against the industrial capacity of America, the manpower of Russia, and the determination of all the Allies. Knowledge wins battles, resources win wars. We had the first, you had the second." The interrogation lasted for 3 days in total. The generals brought in more officers to test Bäke. Each time, he proved his exceptional knowledge. He corrected errors in current American tactical manuals, pointed out contradictions between different field manuals, suggested improvements. On the 3rd day, General Harrison asked, "Would you work with us? Colonel, help us improve our doctrine." Bäke thought for a long time. "The war is over. General, I served my country. If I can now contribute to avoiding future wars, or at least teach more effective tactics, then yes, I will help." These aren't just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that decided the fate of millions. Real soldiers, real fear, real consequences. These stories must never be forgotten. If these historical truths matter to you, please support with YouTube's Super Thanks. The golden heart below. Every super thanks enables me to spend weeks in archives, digitizing rare documents, interviewing surviving witnesses. This story of Colonel Bäke was reconstructed from declassified American military records, German war diaries, and post-war interviews. Without your support, these stories could remain forever in forgotten archives. Help me preserve this story for generations to come. Every contribution directly funds more research, more interviews, more forgotten stories. What happened to Colonel Franz Bäke after 1945? The truth is more complex than you might think. Bäke wasn't a war criminal. He fought with honor, treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, even once saved a group of wounded Americans by negotiating a ceasefire for their evacuation. The Americans found no accusations against him, but they found something else, an incredibly valuable expert. In 1946, Bäke was officially released from prisoner of war camp, but he remained in an American advisory role. The U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the same institution whose doctrine he had studied so thoroughly, hired him as a civilian consultant. His task, to help write the next generation of American field manuals with an emphasis on flexibility and improvisation. The irony wasn't lost. The man who had used American tactics against them was now helping to improve them. From 1946 to 1952, Bäke worked at Leavenworth. He gave lectures to American officers, taught about German Auftrags tactic, about the dangers of predictability. Brigadier General Mitchell, the man who first interrogated him, became a close friend. Mitchell later wrote in his memoirs, published in 1967, "Colonel Bäke taught us more about our own weaknesses than all the war games ever did. He held a mirror up to us and showed us how mechanical we had become. We had produced officers who could follow orders. Bäke taught us to produce officers who could think." The changes in American military doctrine after World War II, particularly the emphasis on flexibility and decentralized leadership in the 1950s, bore Bäke's fingerprints. The revised edition of FM 105 from 1954 included an entire chapter on adaptive leadership and tactical flexibility. In the unclassified version, no author was named. In the classified variant, accessible only to senior officers, The preface stated, with contributions from Colonel Franz Bäke, German Armed Forces, Retiti, based on operational experiences 1940-1945. But there was also controversy. Not all American officers were happy about a former enemy in their midst. In 1948, there were protests from veterans' organizations. How could a German officer teach American soldiers? The Pentagon responded with an unusual step. They released portions of Bäke's war record, showing that he had saved the lives of Allied prisoners on several occasions. A letter from a former American POW, Captain James Moore, who had been captured at Kasserine Pass, was published in several newspapers. Moore wrote, "Colonel Bäke captured me, but he treated me with respect. He shared his rations with us, provided medical care for our wounded. Yes, he beat us in battle. That was his job. But he fought with honor. If such a man can now help us become better soldiers, that is not treason. That is wisdom." The controversy subsided, but not entirely. Bäke remained a controversial figure. He rarely spoke publicly, refused all media interviews. A New York Times article from 1951 quoted him indirectly. Colonel Bäke declined to be interviewed for this story, but communicated through a spokesperson, "I serve the future, not the past. What I did for my country. What I do now, I do for peace." In 1952, at the age of 54, Bäke returned to Germany. The Bundeswehr was just being built, the new German army within NATO. Bäke was invited to teach at the new Bundeswehr Leadership Academy in Hamburg. He accepted, but on one condition. He would also participate in NATO exercises and help develop joint Allied doctrine. The irony was complete. The man who had once studied Allied doctrine to fight it was now helping to create a common doctrine. From 1952 until his retirement in 1963, Bäke taught at the Führungsakademie. His lectures became legendary. He didn't just teach tactics, he taught a way of thinking. Manuals are tools, not Bibles, he often told his students. Understand the principles, but don't be slaves to the procedures. The enemy also has your manuals. What will you do when they know them better than you? His students, young Bundeswehr officers, absorbed these lessons and carried them into their careers. Many of them later became high-ranking NATO commanders, but the secret that only surfaced in the 1970s was even more astonishing. In 1973, as part of the systematic release of documents from World War II, the complete interrogation transcripts of Bäke were published. Historians studied them thoroughly, and they found something shocking. During his interrogations in May 1945, Bäke hadn't just discussed American tactics, he had also analyzed Soviet tactics. In detail and with precision, the American generals who interrogated him immediately forwarded this information to the Pentagon. Bäke's analysis of Soviet doctrine, based on his experiences on the Eastern Front, became a pivotal document for early Cold War planning, a declassified memo from General Eisenhower, then military governor of the American occupation zone, dated June 1945, read, "The information from Colonel Bäke regarding Soviet operational art is of the utmost value. His analysis of their doctrine, tactics, and weaknesses is more detailed than our own intelligence reports. I recommend continued cooperation." Bäke, without public acknowledgement, became one of the earliest advisors for what would later become NATO's strategy against the Warsaw Pact. The ethical questions are complex. Was Bäke an opportunist who switched sides? His defenders argue no. Germany was destroyed, occupied, divided. The war was over. Bäke didn't serve Nazi ideology, but his profession as a soldier. As that war ended, he served the peace and the defense of Western Europe against a new threat. His critics argue that he changed his loyalties too quickly. This debate continues among historians to this day. What isn't debated is Bäke's extraordinary mind. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a German military historian, wrote in his 1989 biography, "The professor in the tank. Franz Bäke represents a rare type of intellectual soldier. He understood war not just as violence, but as a chess game. Each side has moves, predictable through their training and doctrine. Bäke studied these moves for decades. In chess, we would call him a grandmaster. In war, we call him an opponent to be feared." American military historians are more cautious, but respectful. Colonel Reti David Glantz, one of the leading experts on World War II, wrote in 1995, Bäke's contributions to military science are often overlooked because he fought on the losing side. But his methodology, to study and exploit enemy doctrine, is now standard in all modern military academies. We teach exactly what Bäke practiced. Know your enemy as well as you know yourself. Bäke died in 1978 in Munich at the age of 80. His funeral was small, private. But among the mourners were 4 retired American generals, 3 British officers, and a dozen German Bundeswehr generals. Brigadier General Mitchell, now 81 years old, delivered a eulogy. He said, "Franz Bäke was once my enemy. He became my teacher, then he became my friend. He taught us a humbling lesson that the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the most weapons, but the one with the most knowledge. And he taught us that even former enemies can become allies when they share common values of honor and professionalism." In Bäke's estate, his heirs found his private library, over 500 books on military tactics and history in 5 languages. American field manuals from 1917 to 1970, British, French, Soviet documents, notes in the margins, in his neat handwriting, observations, comparisons, analyses. The family donated the entire collection to the Führungsakademie der Bundeswehr in Hamburg, where it now rests in the archives as the Bäke Collection. Military historians from around the world study it, trying to understand how one man, through sheer study and intellect, became one of the most effective tactical thinkers of his generation. One particular document in this collection is a letter Bäke wrote in 1976, 2 years before his death. It was addressed to future officers and left as a posthumous document. The letter, now displayed in the Museum of the Führungsakademie, is a fascinating testament. Bäke wrote, "You will read of my actions in archives, and perhaps think I was a brilliant tactician. I wasn't. I was simply a man who did his homework. While other officers drank and celebrated, I read. While they slept, I studied. There was no secret, no special talent. Just diligence and dedication. The enemy had written manuals. I read them. That was all. The lesson for you is simple. In the modern world, information is everywhere. Your enemies publish their doctrine, their way of thinking, their plans. Read them, understand them, then you will never be surprised, and you will always have an advantage that no weapon can give: knowledge." The impact of Bäke's lessons is visible everywhere in modern militaries. The emphasis on red teaming, where officers are trained to think like the enemy, the establishment of opposition forces at NATO exercises who study and replicate enemy tactics, the requirement for officers to study enemy doctrine as part of their training. All of that can be traced back to Bäke's influence in the 1950s. One man, a former enemy, changed how armies think about preparation and study. There's a famous photograph from 1958, taken during a NATO exercise in Germany. Bäke, in civilian clothes as a consultant, stands next to an American colonel and a British major. They are studying a map. The American colonel points to a position. Bäke shakes his head and points to another. The photo was taken by a military photographer who didn't know who Bäke was. The caption in the archives: NATO officers engaged in tactical planning. But a historian analyzing the image in 1995 identified Bäke. The true caption should be, "The man who once used American tactics against them now teaches the next generation." The irony of history is perfect. The concluding question, the one that still haunts historians and military thinkers, is this: how many others were there like Bäke? How many German officers studied Allied doctrine with such dedication? The answer, it seems, is not many, but some. Declassified German documents revealed that the German armed forces maintained a small detachment within their general staff, its sole purpose to gather and translate Allied military literature. They produced classified reports, distributed to high-ranking commanders, analyzing enemy tactics. But Bäke was exceptional because he did it privately, driven by his own initiative, for decades. Another notable case was Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin, whose book, Panzer Battles, became a standard reference after the war. Von Mellenthin also studied Allied tactics, particularly British desert warfare. His book, published in 1956, contains analyses similar to Bäke's. Von Mellenthin wrote, "The British officer was brave, well-trained and well-equipped, but he was also predictable. British doctrine emphasized thorough preparation and methodical execution. This meant that if you disrupted their preparation, they hesitated. We learned to disrupt them. These insights weren't accidental, they came from diligent study. The modern lesson is clear. In a world where information is freely available, the advantage isn't secret weapons, it's knowledge. Terrorist organizations study Western military doctrine online. Nations analyze publicly available field manuals and training videos. The enemy is doing their homework. The question is, are we doing ours? Bäke's story serves as a warning from the past, one that remains relevant today. The most dangerous enemy isn't always the strongest, it's the most informed. What impressed you the most about this story? Many viewers have shared incredible family stories. Grandfathers who were there, letters discovered in attics, war diaries passed down through generations. Share your family stories from that era in the comments below. Each comment is a piece of history that we can preserve together. I'm especially interested. Does anyone in your family have similar stories of intellectual preparation in war, of soldiers who fought with knowledge rather than just brute force? Your stories are just as important as the ones I tell.